Okay, good morning. This is Special Topics in Research Ethics, number two, Important Documents in Research Ethics. Um, so first of all, my apologies that my voice might sound a little bit weird, and this is because I put on some braces this morning. A very fun experience. Okay, so there are many important documents in the realm of research ethics. And we focused on three because these three are particularly important for social scientists working in the United States of America, many European countries, and in Asia too. The general motivation behind these documents is that researchers are expected, or sometimes legally obligated to conduct studies in an ethical manner. But you might ask, okay, so what is ethical and what is unethical? That really sometimes you might think uh, is idiosyncratic, that is varying between people and people or across different cultures. So that's why it is very important to have a sort of universally accepted set of standards or criteria against which researchers or practitioners of science can agree upon and follow across the world. And this is where these historical documents come in useful. The first one is the Nuremberg Code. This is probably the most important document in research ethics because it preceded everything that follows. And it really is the foundational document. The second one is the Declaration of Helsinki. In a sense, it is sort of a transitional document, you know, greatly supplementing the Nuremberg Code and leading to something that's even more specific, such as the Belmont Report. So the Nuremberg Code really has a lot to do with the Second World War. In that tragic event, both the Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany subjected human beings to what we can say torturous ordeals in the hope of obtaining data that might prove useful in their war effort. What happened to the Japanese scientists is entirely a different story. But what happened to the Nazi German scientists is directly relevant to the issuance of the Nuremberg Code. Um, so the Nuremberg Code was the result of the open trial of many of the Nazi German scientists in the city called Nuremberg in Germany in the year of 1947. So the military court in 1947 issued a 10-point statement, um, and the purpose of the statement is to prevent abuse of human subjects, which had happened during the war. So, what are these 10 points? Well, the first and the foremost, the most important is about voluntary participation. Simply says no one can, through any means, compel anyone else to participate in research, no matter how harmless the research might be. Um, you just cannot put people into a lab or ask people to fill out a questionnaire unless your respondents or subjects agree to do that, right? The second point is the results of the research must be useful and unobtainable by other means. This simply means, you have to prove when you apply for the permission to conduct a study, you, you have to state or make a strong case that this research is valuable and no other means such as through library research, no other means can fulfill this goal, right? So in other words, the benefits must be overwhelming, at least compared to the potential costs of the research. The third point of the Nuremberg Code states that a study must be rationally based on knowledge of disease or condition to be studied. Well, this one, you know, talks about disease or medical conditions, and that's because the Nuremberg Code is really about or the result of reviewing all the medical experiments that Nazi German scientists did during the war. So it talks about disease and conditions, but later on, these principles or points are applied to other aspects of research or other areas of research, including social scientific research that rarely deals with disease or conditions. But anyway, so you can sort of supplement or replace disease or conditions with words such as puzzles or important phenomena or other unresolved issues, right? So that means you cannot just randomly studying anything that suddenly comes to your mind. The topic of study, the topic of research must be well founded based on either previous findings or previous theories, and you must make a logical argument or connection between your proposal and the knowledge that has been accumulated so far. You can't just study random stuff because it will be a waste of human subjects, and that would be deemed as unwise usage. The fourth point of the Nuremberg Code is that research must not subject human subjects to any condition of suffering unless such suffering is well justified. Yeah? Because sometimes, well, I would say that it is very rare in social scientific studies that participants will suffer. Well, they might suffer sometimes very mildly, psychologically speaking, but physical suffering or physiological suffering is rather rare in social scientific studies. But again, we should bear in mind that Nuremberg Code is about was about medical research. So suffering is a big deal. And nowadays, in psychological or social science studies, psychological suffering is just as I should say bad as physical or physiological suffering. So no or minimum suffering relevant to the benefit is a major requirement of doing research ethically. The fifth point is the study cannot include death or disabling injuries as a foreseeable consequence. I think this is rather straightforward. You cannot just cripple people or kill people in the name of research. That's simply cannot be allowed. No matter how important you claim your study to be, killing or you know crippling people is just cannot be accepted. The sixth point is that the benefits of research must outweigh the risk. Well, we mentioned this before. So, some studies have a great deal of benefits, but it's also a very costly and risky one. So then it really falls on the shoulder, or becomes the responsibility of ethics experts to judge or to determine whether this research study can be allowed. So it is, or in other words, from the perspective of researchers, they must make a very strong argument and backed up with evidence and data that their research is more beneficial than is costly or risky. The seventh point stated that researchers, it is the researchers' responsibility and obligation to protect participants, right? It's about safeguarding. The eighth point is that research must be conducted by qualified individuals. In the mind of the drafters of the Nuremberg Code, these qualified individuals will be medical doctors or people with professional trainings. In the context of social scientific studies, then these people, the qualified individuals, will be people with a PhD degree in relevant fields, or graduate students or undergraduate students supervised by a PhD. Number nine is a very important principle. It sort of complements point one, which said, well, point one says participation must be voluntary, but we must understand that such voluntary participation is not a one-time thing. It is it must be applicable at any point of the research. That is, even though a person might voluntarily agreeing to participate in your study, and later on in the process of filling out a questionnaire, for example, this person might say, well, you know what, I don't feel comfortable, or for whatever reason this person would like to stop, and this person has the right to stop. You cannot compel this person to continue, and you cannot penalize the person once the person withdraws him or herself from the study, right? Number 10, and this is about more responsibilities from the perspective of investigators. That is, they have, especially medical research. While number 10 is not really very relevant to social scientific studies, but very, very important for medical research. That is, they must have some kind of a backup plan or emergency plan to be executed once sad situations such as the death or crippling of participants happens. So fortunately for social scientists, we don't really kill or injure people. So, but still, we must have some sort of a contingency plan in our head, at least, to deal with unexpected situations. So that is the Nuremberg Code, which is, I would say, rather general and covers lots of ground. So it's very important, but for any kind of documents of obligations to work, you must be very operational, so to speak. That is, you must have very detailed guidance so that people cannot interpret those points to their convenience, so to speak, right? It must be very unambiguous and very specific, so that there's no room for alternative interpretation. And that's where the Declaration of Helsinki comes in useful. So in 1945, physicians from the World Medical Association, WMA, held a conference in Geneva. And during the conference, they were basically appalled at the atrocities revealed at the Nuremberg trial. So these physicians, they condemned morally what Nazi physicians had done, and so in 1945, so they also issued a document based on the Nuremberg Code to further describe or clarify what physicians should do when they're conducting medical research. So, for example, one of the most important principles that these physicians at a conference believe that they should hold themselves to is the health of my patients, is my first consideration. That is, do no harm, right? Cannot harm people in the name of science. That's the most important thing, or one of the most important duties that these physicians believe they should fulfill. Um, so this code is not yet the Declaration of Helsinki, rather it is the Declaration of Geneva. Because, well, we can also think that the Declaration of Geneva is sort of the first draft of the Declaration of Helsinki, um, because in 1953, the participants of the WMA still thought that, okay, so the Declaration of Geneva is a step forward, is improvement from the Nuremberg Code in the sense that everything now becomes more specific and refined, but they're still not very satisfactory with the status of the Declaration of Geneva. So they further refined the Declaration of Geneva, with regard to physicians' duties as scientists. In fact, um, so the result of this, revision, I should say constant revision, is on the document known as the Declaration of Helsinki. It is a constant revision because um, this declaration, including the Declaration of Geneva, has been revised several times. Most recently in the year 2000, and there's some minor revisions done in the year 2002 and 2004. Um, the current form of the Declaration of Helsinki contains three sections in 32 separate paragraphs, each section on a specific topic. So, section 1 really sets the stage of what human research is and why it is necessary, and stresses the obligations of physicians to prioritize participants' health. Right. So we talked about what human research is in special topic 1 on research ethics, and we just discussed, the first principle laid out in the Declaration of Geneva. Right. The priority of physicians as investigators is participants' health. Um, Section A also reminds physicians that special populations involved in research must be closely monitored. Examples of these special populations include the economically and medically disadvantaged, such as the homeless, or people who lost their jobs. Um, the second class of special population is those who cannot give informed consent, or those who may be doing so under duress. So one example of people who cannot give informed consent is minors. So minors in the context of USA is considered to be incapable of making sound judgments on their own. So they're the people who cannot give informed consent, and those who can give consent, but they might do so under duress, are those people, they're easily influenced. Um, Again, for example, the homeless, right? So you give them $10 to finish a study. Well, you might think that you're doing them a favor, but from the perspective of ethics, you might actually coercing them into participating into research because you're giving them what they exactly need. So this might not actually be considered as ethical because you are taking advantage from them. You're taking their advantage, so to speak. The third class of special population are those who will not benefit personally from the research, um, and you know this is an interesting point because you might think, well, I'm doing a study that might, benefit the entire humankind. Well, you may argue that, but the perspective of from the perspective of research ethics, this might be problematic because you're again not using the correct population, and you might create problems from doing that because um, if these people do not personally benefit from the research, then you cannot justify that the benefit of the research is greater than its costs or risks. Um, Section B of the Declaration of Helsinki states that participation in research must be voluntary. Um, so that is the first principle of the Nuremberg Code, if you recall, and the Declaration of Helsinki elaborate on this principle and states that potential subjects should only um, give consent after being fully informed of the study setup, goals, and sources finding. Um, so, in other words, in order for participant to agree to participate, you must be very honest. Well, I shouldn't use the word honest. You must be very, um, um, how should I put it? You must be providing enough information for participants, potential participants, to make the judgment of whether or not to participate in your research. And the Declaration of Helsinki um, provides a series of requirements saying that these are the aspects of study that you must be fully disclosing to your potential participants in order to gain their consent. In other words, the subjects have the right to refuse to participate in your research unless you tell them the following aspects of study. So, what's the design of a study? What's the goal of a study? And is your study funded by any external or internal sources? Because this one speaks to potential conflicts of interest. Right. So the second is, are there any potential conflict of interest? Um, and that's really a big deal. For example, patients versus pharmaceutical companies, etc. Um, for whom you are working for, right? So for researchers like me or any other faculty in this department, then our research affiliation will be UH Manoa, Department of Communicology. You must tell people your employer. And the risks and benefits of the study. You must tell them that for participants to make reasonable judgments. You must let them know that participants, even though you might have agreed to participate in this research, but it is also your right to withdraw at any moment and at any stage of the study without you know without any risks of being punished by researchers, and your withdrawal from the study would not damage your relationship with the researchers, and would not damage the relationship between the researchers and their employer, right? So, in other words, you want to assure the participants that they can withdraw without any concerns. There's some other important points of Section B. For example, as we just said, only populations likely to benefit from the research should be targeted for recruitment. In other words, um, when you're filing or proposing your studies to the ethics board, um, you must tell very clearly and make a strong case that why you're using this particular body of subjects, how they're going to be benefited from this research that you propose to do. Um, Relatedly, you must be very careful when you propose to use vulnerable populations, um, because those populations are easily under influence, and it is very risky to use them. So it is often the advice from the ethics board that, if you can use quote unquote normal populations, or less vulnerable populations, then you should avoid using vulnerable populations, because the risks of research increase very dramatically once you involve vulnerable populations into the process. Lastly, section B states that if the participant, for example, is underage and unable to give consent, then and if your research really needs that particular subjects from that particular population, then you should obtain an assent from a third party, likely the guardian, legal guardians of those potential participants. For example, the parents of kids, right? So there are many studies that target on infants or on toddlers or minors, especially in the field of developmental psychology. So those potential participants cannot participate in the study because they're not deemed legally capable to give consent. So you must solicit assent from their parents, for example, so that you can then send out questionnaires to those minors, or you can put toddlers or even infants into a lab. Section C of the Declaration of Helsinki says that well, again, it's more relevant to medical research, but it's important to know what's helpful and useful to know. That is, research can only be combined with clinical care if it has the potential to prevent people from, for example, from contracting diseases, or it has the benefit to diagnose diseases, or has the benefit of treatment. So, for example, you're a pharmaceutical company and you're testing out your new drug, um, and of course, the typical practice or a simplified, drug experiment will be, to give one group of people experimental drugs, and or another condition is placebo. So ethically, you should be you should make it known that what aspects of the care are experimental, or not in the context of pharmaceutical research. For example, post-cancer treatment, right? You designed some new procedures to take care of participants who just underwent surgery. So you must tell the participant that this part of the process is experimental, is not, for example, approved by FDA yet, so that participants can make informed consent. A specific paragraph under section C says, any new treatments should be tested against standard treatment. That is, you cannot just throw something new out there and say, well, I have a new procedure, new drug, or a new surgical protocol, and let's try it out. You must have a comparison, and that comparison is something that has been approved by, for example, the FDA, right? And a sort of a offshoot of that, paragraph 29, is that using placebos might be tempting because it's cool and it offers lots of control to your study, but it cannot be used if a known treatment exists. In other words, you cannot play with subjects. You must give them proper care when you're using them as research subjects. Lastly, even though some participants might be subject to the standard treatment, and while some others are subject to the novel or new treatments, and one of the treatments might be better. So that's okay when you're doing the study, but in the end, once you identify that one treatment is better than the other, then all participants in the end should be treated or subjected to that better treatment, whether it's the standard or it's the new treatment, right? Everybody should be treated equally. Okay. All right. So special topic 2 will end here. We talked about the Nuremberg Code. We talked about the Declaration of Geneva, which leads to the Declaration of Helsinki. We haven't talked about the Bellman Report, because the Bellman Report has something that's very specific that will that really will be relevant, very relevant to some other special topics of research ethics. So we'll be talking about the Bellman Report in the next module or class on research ethics. Okay, see you. See you next time.